They had a little more than 4 minutes to reach the aft before S&R Black entered the launch window. Kelly, bringing up the rear of the formation of 4 Marines, was already frustrated. Murdoch, second behind Carb, was holding up the line with his clumsy technique. She made a mental note to get permission from Gunny to beat his ass when they returned to Trident Station. If Gunny is conscious, let alone alive, she thought. The image of him lying in the auto dock filled her mind, a normally powerful and strong-looking Marine rendered helpless. With one eye covered in a patch while the other remained closed to the world outside, he might as well have been trapped in the void. Kelly suddenly wanted to be back there in the infirmary, to be around if something happened. Won't matter if you fuck this up. The voice was her own and yet sounded like Gunny all at the same time. Kelly grinned. Murdoch, move your fucking ass before I kick it off the hull, she growled into the mic.
Yes, boss,
Murdoch yelled back. And he did. His clumsy steps were still aggravating to watch, but at least he was stumbling faster. Yep, he was in for a lot of hell when they returned to Trident Station. She might make him walk around the whole goddamned exterior. A check of her chronometer told her a minute had already passed, but at least they were finally nearing the aft. Went, as large as he was, blocked out much of her view. Instead of trying to catch a peek over his shoulder, she added his helmet feed to her HUD and scanned her side of space looking for movement, but there was none. The SV-52 glided 10 meters away as it slowly maneuvered to cover her squad.
I have you in sight, Corporal,
Talby said. Copy, sir, she said.
You have 2 minutes before the launch window opens,
Black said.
Mark.
You heard her, Kelly said. She switched to Carb's cam and watched as the hump of S&R Black's engine array came into view. Carb, descend and head for the belly. We'll follow.
Copy, boss,
Carb said. Her cam feed panned to the left before reorienting on the edge of the ship's hull. Carb took 4 steps before halting.
Shit, Corporal?
A line of silvery liquid curled in a semicircle centimeters from Carb's boot. The acid eventually drizzled down and out of sight. Squad, a starfish left its calling card. She flipped through her cam feeds looking for signs of movement. Apart from the SV-52 finally reaching its position, nothing moved. It may have been here from before, Carb said. No telling how long this shit has been here. Cut the chatter. Carb, mark it on your HUD and keep going.
Copy, boss,
she said. After shuffling a step further from the substance, she continued walking to the ship's belly. Kelly Mira to Talby.
Go ahead.
Sir, we found acid near the engine array.
Copy,
The lieutenant said. Kelly continued watching her steps, giving herself plenty of space between her and Went, while occasionally glancing at the SV-52's position. The support craft appeared to be dropping below the ship very slowly. Carb reached the intersection and followed the gentle curve to the ship's keel. Even with her rifle in her hands, the weapon raised nearly to shoulder height, her fluid steps held the cam view steady.
At the acid,
Went said nervously. Copy, Kelly said. Carb? So far, so good, boss. Okay, let Went and I get into position before you start your approach to the net tether.
Copy, boss,
Murdoch and Carb said at the same time. Kelly fought the flood of goose flesh that crawled up her arms and over her back. If that was a new trail, they had at least one hostile in the area. At least one. She thought they had been clear of the creatures before they blasted Mira, but there was no telling what had attached itself to the hull before they finished the job. Hell, the moment Talby docked, the damn things had been out there. Hitched a ride, she thought sourly. Squad, she said firmly but slowly. Multiple bogeys likely. Keep your heads on a swivel. Their voices came back cold and matter-of-fact. Everyone copied. Everyone knew what to do. She just hoped they could execute when the time came. The SV-52 slowly dipped below the hull line. Talby held his breath as they finally descended far enough for the cams to provide a view of the keel, the bottom hull appearing to lengthen and narrow during his perspective shift. The 52's lights finally provided detail once it chased away the shadows and phantom shapes. He shivered as he realized the detail faded near the midships, as if the light itself were being eaten. Oh shit. Squad, bottom hull, midships.
Copy,
Kelly said. Private, you see it move? Fire on it, Talby said. Let me know if I need to descend.
Aye, sir. Drop 2 meters.
Talby didn't question. When your gunner said to give them room, you did it, regardless of rank. A deft touch of the controls and a thruster fired. The SV-52 accelerated quickly and stopped just as fast. His view of S&R Black's hull was more broad now, and he could finally see what he'd feared. 4 starfish floated mere centimeters from the ship's keel. The creature's arms had folded around their cores, making them look like polyhedron dice. Their strange shells vibrated in the light like heat haze off metal. Unlike the other starfish they'd encountered, the stowaways' arms pulsed with color, making their skin fade from a dark wavering gray to an impossible black.
Sir, I have a shot.
Copy. Talby's spine crawled just looking at the damn things. The memories of their silvery, acidic excretions and their powerful arms, strong enough to fling Atmos steel flechettes at him like throwing stars, flipped through his mind. And instead of just one, there were 4 of them, each much larger than the last one he'd fought. But they weren't moving. They just floated there, wrapped in their armor as if waiting for something. Maybe they were waiting for the humans to attack. Or something else? Kalimora, what's your status? A few seconds passed before she spoke, her words clipped and cold.
Carb and Murdoch were almost in position to start their climb.
Fuck the climb, Talby said. Suit thrusters, cut that line ASAP. Carb and Murdoch had reached the tow lines. On the way there, the squad had come across several more patches of the deadly, glistening leavings from the starfish creatures. Kelly and Wentz spread out to cover their squad mates, who began descending down the lines. If the ship had to move quickly, Carb and Murdoch were the most vulnerable to fast shifts in the ZG. They could have used the suit thrusters, but if the ship had to EVA for any reason, it could either collide with them or leave them vulnerable to emergency rocket activation. The plan was simple enough. Carb and Murdoch would go down, release the sled from the net, and position it with Black and Noble's assistance. Getting it pointed in roughly the right direction would allow the sled to reach maximum acceleration without having to first adjust the sled's attitude during flight. Once they finished the job, the 2 Marines would ride the net back to the hull, join up with their squad mates, and get their asses back inside the ship. Simple, right? As the pair reached the halfway point, Kali's HUD lit up with a proximity warning. An arm appeared at the end of the tether, its sharp point glistening in the floodlights. It seemed to caress the sled inside the net. Kali heard Carb take a deep breath.
Corporal?
I see it, Kali said. The last word died on her lips as another arm appeared a meter away. Talby yelled at her to cut the line. Understood, sir. However, we have a bit of a problem. We have 2 possible bogies on the sled. Talby groaned.
I don't give a shit, Corporal. Cut that line and get back inside the ship now.
Aye, sir, Kelly said with a wince. Carb, Murdoch, we're cutting the lines. Suit thrusters are authorized. Repeat, use your damn thrusters. Murdoch moved to detach himself from the line and stopped dead. Mere centimeters away, silvery ooze glistened against the cable's dark Atmos steel surface. Freeze! Kelly called over the line, but he already had. The cam feed from his helmet barely twitched. Unhook very carefully and use your 4 thrusters to blast away from the line.
Copy,
he said, his voice vibrating with tension. Carb?
I'm free.
Carb said.
I'll help.
No, you won't. Get back here, now.
But...
Do it! Kelly yelled. She kept her eyes glued to Murdoch's cam, watching as he carefully unhooked from the cable tether and quickly pulled back his arm. With his other hand, the one much further away from the silvery glaze, he gently pushed. Murdoch rose away from the cable meter by meter before engaging his thrusters.
On my way, Corporal,
Murdoch said. She flipped back to her helmet cam feed and looked down the line at Carb. The Lance Corporal was using her thrusters and following the cable back to the hull. Kelly watched her climb further and further over the sled. 3 starfish, their carapaces scattering the light in radiating waves, contracted around the sled, arms crossing and clutching at the net itself. Sir, they're wrapped around the net.
Cut the line. We'll worry about that in a minute. Just get your...
Another creature appeared atop the mound of starfish. Stubby fins that waved in a silent rhythm jutted from its squat body. Long arms, ends tipped with triangles of some glinting material, probed the space around them as if searching. The new creature rose above the sled, its large mandibles clicking and clacking together without making any sound in the vacuum. As they moved, she saw the deep hole that was its maw, a ring of serrated teeth vibrating in the light. The mouth moved quickly forward, and a line of silver shot out of the darkness. Callie cut her maglocks and hit her thrusters at the same time. She lost contact with the hull and flew to port. A meter away, the liquid excretion hit the hull in a puddle, the droplets sticking to the atmos steel rather than dispersing in the ZG. Callie aimed her rifle and fired. The tritium flechette round left the barrel and streaked toward its target as the rocket engine kicked in. The creature tried to duck, but the round hit the side of its horrible face, its mandibles disappearing in a bright blue flash of light. The creature tumbled away into the ZG, half of its head gone. The creatures surrounding the net stirred slightly. She thought droplets of the heavy water had probably hit their shells. Either that, or they knew their exosolar fellow had been killed.
Get out of there!
Talby shrieked over the comms. Squad! Kelly yelled. Retreat! Kelly sent a block command to the tow controls, and the net released at once. The sled slowly moved away, its own momentum slowed by the magnetic force of the net pushing it out. She turned and realized she was on the wrong side of the ship. The emergency airlock was on the starboard side, not the port. She kicked on the thrusters and shot upwards, her rifle pointed at the sled. She rose meter by meter in a controlled ascent, her fingers flexing around the trigger guard, daring the creatures to move again. After a few minutes, she began to relax. The 3 visible starfish encasing the sled hadn't moved again. Were they worshipping it, or drawing energy from the beacon? Something moved below her. Callie looked down and saw a dim outline in the shadows. Ethereal arms swayed and danced with alien grace. Another shadow appeared, and still another. Callie fired her 4 thrusters as the creatures jetted up to meet her. She had time to snap aim and fire a round at each of them, the rifle moving with her arms as though they were one. The flechettes detonated 7 meters from her, the shards of atmos steel breaking through the creature's shell and spraying particles of black material in all directions. An arm whipped upward a mere meter from her boots. Callie fired her chest thrusters and darted backward, her feet just missing the lip of the hull intersection. She increased her speed to 2 meters per second and continued flying backwards, her mind alertly flicking between the rear cam and the creatures in front of her. The danger of ramming into something behind her wasn't nearly as dangerous as the creatures now climbing or floating to follow her. There was no way of knowing if these were the same creatures that had been gathered around the beacon, and it didn't matter. Now she had 4 bogies to deal with.
Kelly Mora, Telby yelled. Status!
Line cut, she said. I repeat, sled is free.
Copy, Telby said. We're having some fun on the keel.
The ship shuddered as if to accentuate his statement. Squad, Kelly called out. Status? Boss, Carb said. We're at the airlock. Where the hell are you? Stuck topside. I have a few friends to deal with.
I'll come get you,
Went said. Negative. Get inside the ship, Kelly snarled. That's an order. The pause was more than long enough to give the creatures the chance to close in. She might be moving at 2 meters per second, but they were accelerating toward her, and Void wept that they could move. The creatures knew about the rifles. Either one encounter with a flechette was enough for them to understand the danger, or they communicated with one another. Either way, the creatures practically danced in the ZG.
Copy, boss,
Carb said.
Entering the cargo bay. Good hunting, Corporal.
Kelly almost said thank you. What she really wanted to say was for them to get the hell out here and save their damned corporal. Kelly snapped her teeth together and banished the fear. If she was going to die, she was going to go down shooting. She fired 4 flechettes in rapid succession, each of the rounds timed to match the pattern the creatures had shown. They moved in half-meter slides and jumps, but always ended up in a formation of sorts. It wasn't consistent, but it was enough for this. The creature on the far left danced right into the round, the flechettes shattering 4 arms and cutting a ragged semicircle through the creature's torso. The second round flew through a gap and disappeared into space, while the last 2 rounds hit the same creature with devastating results. The flechettes ripped through its shell, scattering particles and alien flesh in all directions. But she'd missed one. It had flown backward, either having sensed the impending attack, or it had reflexes the likes of which she couldn't imagine. As it moved backward, she saw what was behind it. More of them. and more of them. "Captain?"
Corporal, are you in the cargo bay?
"No, sir," she said, "but I wish I was." The four creatures slowly unfolded themselves, their arms pointed directly at the SV-52. The radiating waves of darkness slowed, but the pulsing colors around their bodies began speeding up. Talby pushed the SV-52 and cleared S&R Black's keel.
Sir?
Copenhaver called.
We're going to hit the sled.
Cursing, he hit the thrusters hard, taking them at a negative vector from the ship and her ejected cargo. At the same time, he changed their attitude to point back at the ship. The creatures reached S&R Black's aft and cleared it with a sweep of their strange arms. "Private, fire!" She did. A short stair-step of flechette rounds streaked from the cannon. Most of the shots missed, detonating on the ship's hull, but a few struck. Arcs of electricity danced over their shells. One of them burst apart, while another just flailed silently in space. While he swept the area looking for targets, he checked in with Mira. "Are you in the cargo bay?"
No.
She said, and muttered something else. He brought up her cam feed on his HUD. "Fuck me. Just don't die, Mira. We're coming." He gave the 52's thrusters a push, and the craft quickly accelerated back the way it had come. Mira was topside and floating toward the bow. With a thought, he brought up her location on the ship and fed the coordinates to the flight computer. A path immediately appeared on his HUD. Talby continued hitting the thrusters in sequence, following the flowing rectangles on the screen. As he half-looped over Black's topside, Copenhaver aimed and opened fire. A dozen flechettes flew and exploded between the floating figure and the shadowy things chasing her. Two more of the creatures blew apart, but the rest continued their pursuit as if nothing had happened. Kelly was firing too, but the things moved fast enough to evade her shots.
"Sir, bogeys on our 6.
Where the hell are they coming from? Proximity alerts flashed on its HUD. He barely had time to pull at the controls before they disappeared entirely. Whatever had been about to attack had pulled away. On the ship's topside, he watched as 3 of the creatures swam through the emptiness and away from Mira.
"Shit, sir."
Copenhaver said. "What?" He turned his head and blinked. A cloud of CO2 drifted from the port side outlets. Dark shadows flew toward it, some crashing into one another in their scramble to reach it. "Mira, it's your lucky day," Talby said. He reoriented the SV-52 and pushed past S&R Black's bow. "Copenhaver, net the corporal."
"Aye, sir,"
Copenhaver said. A moment later, Mira was in the net and he was flying for the cargo bay.
"Lieutenant,"
Dunn said.
"get your ass in here ASAP."
"Sir, what about the beacon?"
"Get in the ship now."
"Aye, sir," Talby said. The CO2 cloud that had puffed out of the ship was probably dissipating, or maybe the creatures were consuming it. Either way, it wasn't going to last long. If nothing was between him and the cargo bay, he'd be there in seconds. He hoped his luck would hold. Jacked into S&R Black's systems, he'd already seen the creatures. Well, see was the wrong word. Noble had really detected them by monitoring temperature fluctuations along the ship's keel. He'd first thought of the idea during their last battle, but hadn't had time to implement it. Between rescuing Mira, destroying Mira, and getting them under extreme thrust, he'd been a little busy. But it was quite simple, really. The S&R models had all been built for simplified maintenance as well as diagnostics. If their AIs died during battle or some other calamity, the command crew still maintained control of all responsibilities for its functions. Well, close to it anyway. He'd simply run a diagnostic check. During refits, one of the last 3 hull integrity tests involved checks for Atmos steel bonding weaknesses. Since S&R Black's hull had been printed using older techniques, it was possible for microdeformities to appear after enough real-world abuse. As the metal bands began to separate, the shielding layer went first. If one appeared during the next ship's inspection, they cut, patched, reprinted, and hoped they didn't find another next time, and so on. By running the whole temperature check, he'd spotted the creatures as spikes in temperature. In a way, that should have been no surprise. To create radioactivity as high as those things did, they should have an elevated temperature in the near absolute zero environment of space. The closer they came to the hull, the higher the reading. Only problem? He had to repeatedly burst the diagnostic, and it was starting to be a problem. He promised himself to scan only 10 more times when it happened. As soon as he did, he activated the new program, priming the pumps for a waste release. The moment after Mira's destruction, he'd raised the CO2 filter buffer size, building up an excess of CO2 in the tanks. The multiple thrust burns during their acceleration phase had certainly resulted in the crew breathing harder, faster, using up more O2, and expelling more CO2. Watching through all the sensors at once, he and Black adjusted the output, making sure to seed the port side aft with a cloud guaranteed to get the creature's attention. And it had. The things moved as one toward the cloud. Even the creatures surrounding the beacon moved and jittered as though fighting the temptation. When the supply of stored CO2 exhausted itself, the creatures began batting at the hull as if begging for more. Noble grinned. He watched through the ship's cameras as the cargo bay door opened and the SV-52 flew inside it at a nearly suicidal speed. Talby hit the bulkhead a little harder than usual, but the damage would be minimal to both the craft and Black. Noble deactivated the cargo bay door safeties and it slid into place 3 times its normal speed. He re-engaged the safeties and immediately pressurized the cargo bay. Seconds later, Callie Moore's squad was getting her detached from the 52 while Talby and Copenhaver cleared the canopy. But Noble had stopped watching. He and Black saw through the same interfaces, but monitored different aspects, coming to agreements as fast as his brain could keep up. The creatures wrapped around the beacon had caused the sled to slowly spin. As long as they didn't stop or change the cycle, their calculation would work. It was all about timing. They found an optimal trajectory with minimal attitude adjustment and waited together for nanoseconds to see if their guess was right. It was. The sled's rockets came to life and the slab of Atmos steel quickly accelerated while the attitude thrusters burned to correct its course. With the sled streaking off toward Pluto and their supply of free food exhausted, the creatures followed in its wake. Noble watched in fascination as the alien things retreated into the Kuiper Belt's deep shadows, floating like misshapen, nightmarish ghosts. He ran another diagnostic sweep over the ship. No hotspots. They were as clear as they could be for the moment. And he needed a break, damn it. But not now. Not yet. Chapter 67. Snug in the acceleration couch, Dickerson could hardly move. The escape pod's rockets continued firing every few seconds, keeping the capsule under thrust and at half a G of acceleration. He hadn't realized just how much pain he was in until the G-forces had time to work on his tired muscles, bruised flesh, and broken bones. The throbbing in his chest and shoulder told him his nannies had finally run out of cannabidiol, THC, and analgesics. He literally had nothing left in the tank. He considered moving, finding the emergency aid kit, and doing what he could to lessen the pain, but it seemed more trouble than it was worth. He'd had worse. Hell, he'd fought with worse. Right now, he was just tired. In pain, sure, but mainly tired. Besides, what was the point of juicing himself now? He was likely going to die in here, the pod ultimately becoming his very own Atmos steel coffin. The O2 supply in his suit was nearly gone, the pod's systems were more than a little damaged to begin with, and its O2 reserve sure as hell wasn't going to be enough to get into Pluto. He tried using comms on all channels, including block comms, but either no one was listening or the pod wasn't transmitting. From inside the pod, it was impossible for him to connect with external sources, and he imagined the pod's comms array were damaged to begin with. No way to communicate. Perfect end to a perfect mission. Dickerson grunted and fingered his vibroblade. He would rather die in space or with his veins open than from suffocation. If it came to that, he'd open the escape pod using the emergency handle and drift out into the darkness. All he'd have to do after that was find the courage to take off his helmet. The temperature and the vacuum would take him quickly. Quickly enough, anyway. The creatures had followed the pod for a ways before giving up the chase. Maybe its acceleration was a little too much for the beasties, or he just wasn't as interesting a morsel as he'd feared. Like most things that had happened, he'd never know. He'd die without knowing. The not knowing was the worst part about flying off into the darkness on his own. He'd never know if his squad had made it out of Mira. He'd practically thrown Kalimura into her pod and ejected her against orders. Maybe it saved her life. Maybe not. Either way, she got one of the pods that had passed inspection. Maybe her luck had been better than his. He certainly hoped so. He imagined Kalimura, Went, and Carbs standing in the cargo bay, the three of them wondering where he was and if he was alive. Or maybe the entire crew had already given him up for dead. If the escape pod was as damaged as he feared it was, its transponder might not even be working. Trying to track the pod would be impossible for S&R Black. Hell, he'd probably be invisible to PEO's sensor arrays too. So fucked, he whispered and chuckled. The laugh quickly died. Breathing that deeply hurt the hell out of his ribs. Once the last of his adrenal reserves had faded, the pain in his shoulder and chest had risen another notch or two. The swelling of tortured tissue made his nerves sizzle, and not in a good way. In another hour or so, every breath would be its own battle between the pain and the need to drag oxygen into his lungs. Maybe the escape pod would travel far enough to rendezvous with PEO. The station personnel could fire a tether, pull the pod into the station's small cargo bay, open it, and find a suited corpse. Or, more likely, an open pod with a frozen corpseicle on the couch. One more dead Marine, one more casualty from the Mira mission. I hope they blow you the fuck up, he drawled. The giant ship, a plague-ridden Trojan horse, needed to be blown to pieces before it could endanger the rest of humanity. Maybe it wouldn't matter. He'd had a lot of time to think over the past hour, and he'd come to a conclusion. Humanity was fucked. If you counted on the principles of evolution, then the creatures that had found their way into Sol System were possible. They seemed to share many of the same traits, despite their structural and locomotive differences. They had prey, they had predators, and they had a way to survive in a minimal ecosystem. He would have been able to swallow all of that, if not for the beacon. The beacon's existence suggested something more insidious. An intelligence greater and far older than humanity's had sent the beacon on a journey through the Milky Way to find Sol. Or maybe that was a coincidence, and it was nothing more than humanity's misfortune to discover it and their foolhardy nature to bring it back. Perhaps the beacon was meant to spread the life forms across the galaxy, maybe an innocent but misguided attempt to populate lifeless space. Or maybe there was another reason he was incapable of conceiving. Shit, trying to think like a superior mind was giving him a headache. Whomever or whatever had sent the beacon into their area might eventually come to see the fruits of their labors. Should any of humanity still be around, what would the visitors make of them? Would they destroy the humans to keep them from exploring the stars? Or was there some other use for humanity? Slavery? Food? He shivered as he remembered the pine cone's silver, sharp talons and the horrifying starfish maws. Food seemed likely, although he couldn't remember an instance in which the creatures tried to eat them. They did seem to like carbon dioxide, though, and that was something human beings produced simply by inhaling oxygen.
You have 20 minutes of suit atmosphere remaining,
The computer chimed in his headset. 20 minutes. Great. After that, he'd be on whatever reserves the escape pod had. And according to the onboard computer, it wasn't much. All he could do was breathe as shallowly as possible and wait for the onboard supply to dwindle to nothing. Maybe then he'd have the guts to open the hatch and kill himself. Dickerson leaned back on the couch and closed his eyes. Fuck it. Even if the alien species that had brought these creatures here showed up, he'd be long dead. Especially since it looked like that was going to happen very, very soon. Something bumped against the side of the escape pod. Dickerson's eyes opened at once. He connected to the escape pod cameras and then remembered they weren't functioning. Cursing, he connected to the escape pod's diagnostics and checked for heat signatures. The hull was intact and cold, cold, cold. No heat sources. Nothing out there. The sound came again. He raised his head and stared at the escape pod's ceiling. Whatever made the sound was above him. Something slid across the metal with a sickening screech. Were the creatures out there? A starfish trying to cut its way in and pluck a prize from the tin can? He fingered his blade again. He had more than enough ammo in his rifle to take care of a few exosolar beasties, but going out in ZG while clutching a vibroblade and nothing else seemed much more heroic. If you were going to die anyway, might as well go out in a blaze of stupid machismo. A grin spread across his face as he pulled the blade from its sheath and held it in his right hand. The screeching sound repeated, followed by a bump which rattled the pod. He stood from the couch, maglocked his boots to the deck, and waited. His heartbeat and breathing had increased, making his remaining atmosphere drop by the second. It didn't matter. He'd be dead any moment now. Something rattled against the hatch. He imagined one of the starfish out there, its body wrapped around the escape pod, talons scratching at the hatch seams, preparing to pop it open like a ration tin. Dickerson's body fell into the SFMC hand-to-hand ZG stance. He sent a block command, and the blade turned from a hard, flat black piece of metal into a wavering, blurring piece of steel. He didn't know if it could cut through their carapaces, but he hoped so. Just enough to make it remember him, if not kill it. Another scratch against the hull. This time, he was certain it was plucking at the hatch seam. In a few heartbeats, the hatch would burst loose, and a dark thing, radiation pouring off its body, would reach in and drag him out. Dickerson tried to keep his breath slow even as his heart raced. His adrenaline reserves were gone. He had nothing left. All he could hope for now was to give the alien son of a bitch a good fight. A green light appeared on the escape pod's staticky, mostly broken diagnostic screen. Dickerson blinked at it. Green? What the hell did green mean? Usually it meant the pod was inside an oxygenated environment. Green. His legs began to shake as the hatch popped open and slid aside. Bright light poured in through the hatchway, all but blinding him. Dickerson's screens adjusted, and he found himself looking at a bulkhead. A pair of hands, human hands, appeared at the left edge. A heartbeat later, Mira slid into view. Her face lit up with a smile, eyes looking almost teary. You planning on stabbing me with that, Marine? Dickerson looked dumbly at the knife in his hands. He'd been clutching it so tightly that he had difficulty flexing his fingers. The blade stopped vibrating, once again turning into a dead hunk of metal. Corporal? Yup, she said. Carb appeared next to her. Mira looked at the other squad mate. What do you think, Carb? She shrugged. I say we give him some fresh O2 and send him back into the void. Sounds like standard punishment procedure for disobeying a direct order. Dickerson swayed slightly, his chest burning with pain. Where am I? Mira walked inside the escape pod, one hand held out to him. Home, she said.